The morning I walked into King County Family Court with a binder pressed against my ribs. The room looked at me like a woman already finished. Derek Lawson stood beside his lawyer with that polished nonprofit smile and said loudly enough for strangers to enjoy, "My wife could not afford counsel if she sold the furniture." And a few people actually laughed. Even Judge Helen Carver gave me one quick glance before looking back down. And that glance told me exactly what they all believed before I had spoken a single word. Owen Kincaid adjusted his cuff, watched me sit down, and offered the kind of smile that feels worse than open cruelty when he murmured that I still had time to stop humiliating myself. Vanessa Cole sat one row behind them in a cream coat with her phone tilted toward her lap, wearing the calm look of a woman who thought she had already won the only version of this story that mattered. I laid my binder on the table, touched the cover once, and felt the whole room settle into that old assumption that a quiet woman with a soft life must also be an ignorant one. When the clerk asked whether I would be representing myself, I stood before anyone could pity me and said, "Yes, Your Honor, and I'm ready to proceed." Derek laughed under his breath. Vanessa finally looked up, and Owen's eyes sharpened when he noticed the binder was tabbed, indexed, and marked with the kind of precision nobody builds in a panic. Judge Carver lifted her chin and watched me a second longer, not because she trusted me yet, but because evidence had entered the room before I named it. I kept one hand on the binder and began where none of them expected, telling the court I had been raised on the forensic notes of a woman whose work still shaped litigation across Washington. Owen lost his smile first. Derek shifted a beat later, and Vanessa lowered her phone when I said, "I did not come here without training. I came here with the only training that ever mattered." By the time I opened the binder and turned to the first indexed page, the room that had welcomed me like a joke had gone completely silent. They saw a woman who restored brittle letters, flattened warped paper, and cataloged forgotten records for a cultural archive in Seattle, then assumed that kind of life could not prepare anyone for war. My work had never looked impressive to men like Derek Lawson because it happened under soft lamps, inside acid-free boxes, with gloves, pencils, and a patience they mistook for passivity. What they never understood was that I spent my days spotting altered dates, substituted pages, broken provenance, and tiny inconsistencies that turned one innocent document into a lie. That was the skill I carried into my marriage long before I carried it into court, though for years I used it to preserve peace instead of testing what stood beneath it. Derek built his life in public as the polished head of Northline Futures, smiling through donor dinners and youth mentorship speeches, always framed as the kind of man cities love to reward. Standing beside him, I became easy to summarize. The quiet wife with careful hands, a part-time archivist whose life sounded smaller every time he introduced it. What none of them knew was that I had grown up in rooms filled with bankers' boxes, deposition binders, and legal pads scored with red pencil notes from my mother's old forensic files. She was gone before I was fully grown, but she left behind a discipline that settled into my bones early, the habit of checking dates twice and believing paper before charm. By 12, I could read a reimbursement ledger without getting lost, track a missing attachment from a reference line, and hear danger in the phrase, "It's just a clerical error." So when Derek's life began to shift in ways that were too small to accuse and too repeated to ignore, I did not answer with noise because noise destroys pattern. I answered the way I had been trained, by watching what changed, what vanished, what returned under a cleaner label, and which facts refused to line up once they were placed side by side. By the time that courtroom decided I was only a wife walking in alone, I had already spent my whole life learning what false records sound like when they want to be believed. I did not start with lipstick on a collar or a hotel key in a pocket, because Derek Lawson was too polished for mistakes that obvious and too vain to repeat them twice. I started with his expense habits, because money always relaxes before people do. And one night he left his laptop open on a reimbursement sheet labeled Community Outreach Travel. 3 categories sat there too neatly: creative retreat logistics, donor hospitality, and regional youth engagement, all charged within 48 hours of one another, all approved without supporting detail. The next morning, I pulled Northline Future's public calendar, matched those dates against donor events, then compared them with flight confirmations Derek had forwarded himself and failed to delete. Nothing lined up the way legitimate work usually does, because the organization had no scheduled retreat, no listed sponsor dinner, and no youth program stop anywhere near Portland. What looked harmless in a spreadsheet began to harden when I stacked it beside timestamps, because the charges moved like work language while the dates moved like private pleasure. Vanessa Cole entered the picture the same way all deliberate women do, not by confessing herself, but by leaving her fingerprints where she believed nobody like me would know to look. Her approval signature appeared on 2 vendor reimbursements. Then her name surfaced again, inside an email thread where identical hotel folios were renamed under separate billing categories. One night she posted a rooftop photo wearing a sponsor bracelet from an event Derek claimed ran late. And 3 days later, that exact amount appeared as youth donor dinner materials. I began building folders the way I had done since I was young. One for travel, one for approvals, one for public-facing language, and one for internal records. Every time Derek leaned across the kitchen island and breathed, "You worry too much," I let him think the sentence still worked, then saved another invoice, another screenshot, another contradiction. By the end of the second month, I no longer believed I was tracing an affair with good branding wrapped around it. I believed I was tracing theft, dressed as civic virtue. Ruth Ellison confirmed the part I could already see, but needed anchored outside my marriage. Because she had once handled compliance and still kept clean copies. She did not dramatize anything when we met. She only pointed to a vendor address that led to mail forwarding, a sponsor report edited after approval, and Vanessa's authorization trail. After that, the shape of it stopped being emotional and became structural. And once I saw how the money traveled, I understood the affair was only the door Derek had left open. I did not open my binder the way a wounded wife opens proof of betrayal, with trembling hands and a plea to be believed before the first page lands. I opened it the way a person opens a case already built in silence, placing the index before Judge Helen Carver, then the exhibit list, then the chain of custody summary. By the time the colored tabs showed across the table, Owen Kincaid had stopped wearing that patient smile men use when they think they are about to manage a woman's emotions. I began with structure because structure survives contempt, and I wanted the court looking at order before anyone tried reducing me to a grieving spouse. Exhibits 1 through 6 establish timeline and access, and Exhibits 7 through 12 establish source integrity, authorship, and submission history, I said, sliding the first packet forward without rushing. Derek Lawson shifted in his chair when Judge Carver lowered her eyes to the labels, because even he could hear that I was not presenting pain. I was presenting sequence. The first layer was correspondence, not theater, and I read from an email Derek had sent Vanessa Cole after midnight from his work account. "She notices nothing if I keep the schedule busy," I said, then placed the printed header beside it, so the timestamp, routing path, and sender records spoke before anyone could soften it into context. Owen rose quickly and called it selective, but the objection weakened the moment I handed up the full thread with the delivery record attached behind it. I moved next to rideshare summaries, dinner charges, and travel receipts matching nights Derek had described at home as donor obligations tied to Northline Futures. Judge Carver compared one receipt to the organization's published calendar, saw there was no event that evening, and asked for the next supporting page before Owen could interrupt her focus. Derek stopped looking at me after that and stared at the table instead, which was all I needed to know about where the first fracture had opened. Then I turned to Vanessa, not as a mistress standing near my marriage, but as a name tied directly to approvals she had no innocent reason to touch. This reimbursement was approved under donor hospitality. Yet the matching hotel folio shows a private suite and 2 guests. I said, laying the internal duplicate beside the submitted invoice. By the time I reached for the next tab, nobody in that courtroom was looking at my binder like a wife's heartbreak anymore. I moved to the next tab and told the court the affair was not the deepest injury here, only the easiest one to recognize because betrayal is always louder than accounting. Then I placed the vendor chart before Judge Helen Carver and showed 3 business names tied to the same forwarding address, the same contact number, and the same payment rhythm. Owen Kincaid leaned in as if closer reading might change what was there. But duplicate addresses do not become coincidence just because an expensive lawyer squints at them. One invoice billed Northline Futures for workforce media prep, another billed artist travel coordination, and a third described youth outreach support. Yet all 3 landed within one private weekend. I laid the Portland hotel folio beside them, then the flight confirmation, then the submitted reimbursement packet, and the language changed while the dates, locations, and dollar amounts refused to. These are not program expenses, I said, holding the final copy steady. They are personal expenses moved through charitable language so they could survive review. Judge Carver asked for the sponsor calendar from that same week, and once it was placed beside the receipts, the gap opened so cleanly nobody could pretend not to see it. There had been no youth event in Portland, no donor dinner at that hotel, and no scheduled retreat requiring a suite for 2 guests and private dining charges. Derek Lawson finally looked up when the court compared the folio timestamp to the reimbursement approval, because Vanessa Cole's authorization sat there attached to a charge she had no reason to bless innocently. That was when the room stopped treating Vanessa like a side effect of my marriage and started seeing her as part of its machinery. Because signatures are harder to romanticize. I read from the edited sponsor report Ruth Ellison had preserved. First, the approved version, then the altered one, and the substitutions were small enough to look harmless until heard together. Student dinner materials replaced rooftop cocktails. Regional engagement lodging replaced executive suite. And every clean phrase landed on top of a charge that had already told the truth. The collapse did not happen in one dramatic gasp. It happened line by line. As the image Derek had sold to Seattle lost its shelter under paper that would not protect him, he had built a public life on mentorship, grants, and civic language. Yet every supporting page I handed forward showed money bending away from mission and toward appetite. By the time I closed that section of the binder, nobody in that courtroom was looking at Derek like a generous man caught in an affair. They were looking at a man whose ethics had died long before his marriage did. When Judge Helen Carver allowed me to proceed, I did not rise with anger because anger would have given Derek Lawson something human to push against. I rose with the next exhibit already open and asked, "Can you identify the vendor listed on this reimbursement packet?" Then held the page where his approval sat above the forwarded payment. Derek tried to answer broadly, talking about outreach partners and routine operations. But the invoice carried the Portland forwarding address already established in evidence, so his vagueness landed against a fact. I asked whether Northline Futures had held any donor event in Portland that weekend, and he said yes too quickly, the way people do when speed feels safer than memory. Then I placed the public calendar beside the hotel folio and asked him to point to it, and when his hand did not move, the silence answered before he could. Owen Kincaid leaned forward and objected to tone, but the court overruled him because the question was simple. The exhibit was already admitted, and Derek had nowhere clean left to stand. I turned to Vanessa Cole and asked whether she had approved the reimbursement coded as donor hospitality, then waited while she read her own authorization at the bottom. She tried to separate the approval from the stay, but I placed the internal duplicate beside the submitted copy and asked, "Is this your electronic signature on both versions?" And her throat closed before the word yes finally appeared. That was the moment I understood quiet can sharpen into something harder than fury. because every question I asked was tied to paper that had already spoken. Then I returned to Derek and asked whether he had ever described those charges to me at home as donor obligations. And he said, that was the working assumption. I let that phrase sit for one breath, then placed the flight confirmation, dinner receipt, and sweet folio in a row, and answered with the only mercy he had left, which was accuracy. No, I said, looking directly at him while Judge Carver watched the pages instead of his face. That was the lie you chose because you believed I would never learn how money sounds when it stops telling the truth. Judge Helen Carver did not look at me with sympathy when she began to rule, and that mattered more than kindness because sympathy bends while findings stay on the record. She reviewed the admitted exhibits in order, named the duplicate invoices, the altered sponsor language, the unsupported reimbursements, and the approval trail carrying Vanessa Cole's electronic authorization. By the time she turned to Asset Division, nobody in that courtroom was waiting for a dramatic rescue anymore, because the paper had already done the hardest work. She found that Derek Lawson had used marital resources for personal purposes, had mischaracterized expenditures during the marriage, and had damaged the financial integrity of the household itself. Then she stated, in the calm tone courts use when facts have finally outrun performance, that this pattern supported a finding of marital waste. Owen Kincaid lowered his eyes to his notes. Derek stared straight ahead without blinking, and I stood there hearing the law say aloud what I had known in private for months. The court awarded me a larger share of the marital estate, required reimbursement, and accounting for funds diverted through the relationship, and ordered preservation of the underlying financial records. Judge Carver made clear that family court was not there to punish every lie a husband could tell, but it was there to recognize what those lies had cost. When she finished that portion of the ruling, the silence in the room changed again, because it no longer felt like tension waiting to break. It felt like truth settling into place. She also noted that the admitted exhibits reflected conduct extending beyond the ordinary scope of a divorce case, and that those materials were to remain preserved accordingly. Derek finally moved then, not with outrage, but with the slow collapse of a man discovering that reputation cannot cross-examine documents into becoming harmless. I walked out knowing the court had not avenged me, and that was exactly why the ruling mattered, because it confirmed I had been right. I did not leave that courthouse wanting to build a better life out of Derek Lawson's ruin, because ruin is unstable and I had already spent too many years standing on it. I left wanting rooms that answered only to my name, mornings that did not begin with concealment, and work that would never again depend on a man's appetite pretending to be leadership. Within 2 weeks, I had moved into a smaller apartment in Seattle, carried in the records I meant to keep, and left behind every object that had once made endurance look respectable. The quiet there felt different from the quiet inside my marriage, because this one did not hide anything and did not ask me to shrink so somebody else could stay enlarged. I hung my mother's old red pencil above my desk, stacked my labeled folders in a clean cabinet, and opened the windows wide enough to let ordinary city noise sound like freedom. When I brought home a retired search and rescue dog with watchful brown eyes and a scar across one shoulder, I touched his collar and whispered, "We both get to start honest now." 3 months later, the consequences I had not chased began arriving anyway. Not as gossip, but as the slow public erosion of a structure built on misuse and performance. Sponsors withdrew. Internal records were reviewed. Northline Futures stopped moving through Seattle with the easy confidence it had worn while Derek and Vanessa Cole believed language could sanitize anything. Ruth Ellison stayed exactly who she had been from the start, careful and precise, and her preserved copies mattered because institutions listen differently when evidence survives the people who tried to outtalk it. I did not become interested in spectacle after that, and I did not want my pain turned into a brand just because I had survived it in public. What I built instead was a small service with my own name on the door, helping women organize records, map timelines, and walk into legal aid with documents that could stand up without apology. The The first binder I opened for that work was not a relic from my marriage, but a new file. Blank. Orderly. And mine. And that was the moment I understood supremacy could look quiet as long as it answered to truth. If this chapter stayed with you, like the video and subscribe, because I'm here to keep sharing stories about dignity, peace, and women rebuilding their lives with truth. Thank you for staying with me to the end. And stay close for the next story waiting just ahead.